In a shocking departure from his usual playful banter, Stephen Colbert's interview with Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett erupted into a heated exchange of political barbs and personal attacks, culminating in an unprecedented walkout that has left the late-night world reeling. The tension in Studio 50 at the Ed Sullivan Theater was palpable even before the cameras started rolling. Staffers had noticed an unusual edge to Stephen Colbert's pre-show routine, his typically jovial demeanor replaced by an intensity that suggested tonight's show would be different. When Representative Jasmine Crockett walked onto the set after the commercial break, the applause was enthusiastic but brief, as if the audience could sense the brewing storm. Colbert began warmly enough, welcoming the Texas Congresswoman with his trademark smile, though keen observers might have noticed it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Welcome to the show, Representative Crockett. Great to have you here. You've had quite a journey from civil rights attorney to Congress. I understand you're making waves on Capitol Hill." Crockett, dressed in a striking blue pantsuit, smiled confidently and settled into her chair. "Thank you for having me, Stephen. Yes, I believe in speaking truth to power and advocating for my constituents. Someone has to shake things up in Washington." The conversation flowed naturally at first, as they discussed her background and early career achievements. Colbert nodded along, occasionally interjecting with witty observations that drew appreciative chuckles from the audience. But then, almost imperceptibly, the tone shifted. "So, Representative Crockett," Colbert said, leaning forward slightly, his voice taking on an edge that regular viewers hadn't heard before. "You've been quite vocal about your progressive stance on criminal justice reform. Some might say extraordinarily vocal." Crockett maintained her composure. "I believe in a system that works fairly for everyone, regardless of their background or socioeconomic status. The data clearly shows—" "The data," Colbert interrupted, making air quotes with his fingers. "Interesting how data always seems to support exactly what politicians already believe." The audience laughed nervously, unsure if this was part of the usual comedic routine or something more confrontational. "Well, that's why we have peer-reviewed studies and statistical analysis," Crockett replied evenly, "to prevent our biases from—" "Speaking of biases," Colbert cut in again, "let's talk about your recent comments on border security. You called the current policies inhumane theater. That's quite the characterization for measures meant to protect American citizens, wouldn't you say?" The atmosphere in the studio changed perceptibly. The audience grew quieter. Production assistants exchanged worried glances off camera. This wasn't the light-hearted political ribbing that Colbert was known for. There was a sharpness to his tone that suggested something more personal. Crockett straightened in her chair. "I stand by those comments. When policies separate families and fail to address root causes, they become performative rather than effective. I believe in smart border security that maintains our humanity." "Humanity," Colbert repeated, a sardonic smile playing at his lips. "That's a convenient buzzword when you're not the one dealing with the consequences. Your district is hundreds of miles from the border, yet you position yourself as an expert." The audience's discomfort was audible now, scattered coughs, shifting in seats. A few uncomfortable laughs broke the tension momentarily, but it was clear this wasn't typical late-show banter. "I don't need to live on the border to understand immigration policy, Stephen," Crockett responded, her voice cooling several degrees. "Just as I don't need to experience poverty firsthand to fight for economic justice." That's a reductive argument, and frankly, beneath the level of discourse I expected on this show. For a moment something flickered across Colbert's face. Perhaps recognition that he was crossing a line, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. The show's producers were frantically signaling from off-stage, but Colbert seemed determined to press on. "Let's move on to your economic proposals then," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've advocated for expanded social programs that would cost taxpayers billions. Some might call that fiscally irresponsible. Some might call it investment in our future," Crockett countered, her patience visibly wearing thin. The research shows that every dollar invested in education, healthcare, and infrastructure returns multiples to our economy. But I suspect you've already made up your mind about my positions, haven't you? The tension was building like a pressure cooker. Behind the scenes, the show's executive producer was contemplating whether to cut to commercial, something almost unheard of during a guest segment. But before any decision could be made, Colbert launched into his most pointed attack yet. "What fascinates me, Representative," he said, leaning back in his chair with an air of casual dismissal, "is how politicians like yourself can advocate for wealth redistribution while enjoying the benefits of privilege. You rail against the system that you're very much a part of." He turned to the audience with an exaggerated wink. "Do as I say, not as I do, right, folks?" The audience's reaction was mixed. A few uncomfortable laughs, but mostly shocked silence. This wasn't the Colbert they knew, the one who typically reserved his sharpest barbs for those he perceived as abusing power, not those fighting against such abuses. Crockett's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I think you're confusing advocacy with hypocrisy, Stephen. I've never claimed to be perfect, but I've dedicated my career to improving a broken system. And frankly, I'm surprised that someone who has built their brand on speaking truth to power would resort to such cheap shots." A palpable ooh rippled through the audience. The interview had veered into uncharted territory, a public confrontation that was captivating and uncomfortable in equal measure. Backstage, crew members watched in stunned silence as the exchange continued to escalate. "Cheap shots?" Colbert repeated, his eyebrows raised in mock surprise. "I thought we were having an honest conversation about political consistency. Your voting record shows support for increased regulation of private businesses, yet you've benefited from corporate donations to your campaign. Some might call that, what's the word, hypocritical?" The camera caught Crockett's face in close-up, revealing a momentary flash of genuine anger before she composed herself. She took a deep breath, placed her hands deliberately on the armrests of her chair, and leaned forward. "Stephen," she said, her voice calm but with an unmistakable steel underneath, "I came on this show expecting a thoughtful discussion about policy and progress. Instead, you've chosen to ambush me with half-truths and gotcha questions. If you'd done your research properly, you'd know that I've consistently pushed for campaign finance reform and have one of the lowest percentages of corporate donations in Congress." The audience was completely silent now, riveted by the unexpected drama unfolding before them. Colbert's expression flickered between surprise and something that looked almost like satisfaction, as if this confrontation was exactly what he'd been aiming for all along. "Research," he scoffed. "I've got researchers who've been tracking your public statements for weeks. Let's talk about your position on energy policy. You claim to support green initiatives while representing a state deeply invested in fossil fuels. How do you square that circle?" What happened next would become the most talked-about moment in late-night television history for years to come. Instead of becoming defensive, Congresswoman Crockett's demeanor suddenly shifted. A slow, knowing smile spread across her face as she glanced at her watch, then back at Colbert. "You know what's interesting, Stephen?" she said, her voice even, but resonating with newfound power. "I've been on your show for exactly 7 minutes now, and in that time, you've misrepresented my voting record, dismissed empirical evidence as political bias, and tried to paint me as a hypocrite using cherry-picked facts. I wonder why you're so intent on discrediting me tonight." Colbert's smile faltered slightly. "I'm just asking the questions my audience wants answered, Representative. Isn't that what journalism is about?" "Journalism, yes," Crockett replied, pulling out her phone. "Character assassination, no. But perhaps there's something else motivating tonight's unusual hostility," the audience murmured as Crockett swiped through her phone. Colbert shifted in his seat, his typical confident posture subtly deflating as Crockett continued. 3 weeks ago, my office introduced legislation that would close tax loopholes exploited by certain media conglomerates, she said, looking up from her phone directly into Colbert's eyes. Specifically, companies like the one that signs your rather impressive paychecks. Was tonight's ambush about public accountability, Stephen, or protecting your corporate interests? The audience gasped audibly. Backstage, producers frantically began discussing damage control options. This wasn't in the script, wasn't part of the planned banter. Colbert's face momentarily froze before he attempted to regain control. "That's quite the conspiracy theory, Congresswoman," he said, his voice tight. "Let's get back to your voting record on—" "Let's not," Crockett interrupted, her voice firm but controlled. "Let's talk about how, before I came on stage tonight, your producer warned me that you were in a mood and might go a little harder than usual. Let's talk about how your researchers contacted my office requesting information about entirely different topics than what you've ambushed me with tonight." Colbert's face flushed slightly. Camera operators exchanged glances, uncertain whether to keep filming or cut away. The audience was completely silent now, witnessing something unprecedented in late-night television. "The public deserves robust debate, Stephen," Crockett continued. "But what they're getting tonight is a carefully orchestrated attempt to discredit a politician who's threatening your parent company's bottom line. The same parent company that donated significantly to opponents of my campaign, by the way." "That's a serious accusation," Colbert replied, visibly struggling to maintain his composure. "Our show has always prided itself on integrity." Crockett finished his sentence. "I've watched your show for years, Stephen. I've admired how you've spoken truth to power and used humor to expose hypocrisy. That's why I agreed to come on tonight, despite my staff's concerns about recent pattern shifts in your political coverage." She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out several folded papers. "I came prepared, though. These are transcripts of your interviews with politicians supporting the same policies I do, but without financial implications for your network. The tone difference is illuminating." The control room was in chaos now. The show's executive producer was shouting into his headset, demanding they cut to commercial, but the floor director, transfixed by the unfolding drama, wasn't responding. Cameras continued to roll as Colbert's famous composure crumbled visibly. "We interview all our guests with the same journalistic standards," he insisted, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Do you?" Crockett asked, arching an eyebrow. She turned to face the audience directly. "Here's what viewers at home might not realize. Before agreeing to appear on any show, politicians receive a list of potential topics. It's standard practice. What's not standard is completely abandoning those topics to launch personal attacks based on misleading information." The audience murmured louder now, some calling out support for Crockett. Colbert glanced off stage, clearly looking for assistance. From his producing team that wasn't coming. The tide was turning in the studio and everyone felt it. "Representative Crockett," Colbert began, attempting to redirect. "No one's launching personal attacks. I'm simply asking—" "Let me stop you." "Right there," Crockett cut in, rising slightly from her chair. "You've spent the last 10 minutes implying I'm a hypocrite, questioning my integrity, and dismissing evidence-based policies as partisan bias. If that's not a personal attack, I don't know what is." She stood fully now, commanding the attention of the entire studio. The audience, sensing a pivotal moment, fell completely silent. "But here's what viewers at home should really know," she continued, her voice resonating with conviction. 2 days ago, your parent company's lobbyists were in my office, attempting to persuade me to water down my proposed media ownership transparency bill. When I refused, they mentioned how unfortunate it would be if public opinion turned against me. And now here we are." Colbert's face drained of color. He glanced off stage where his executive producer was frantically signaling to cut the segment. But it was too late. Crockett was in complete control of the narrative now. "You've built a career holding power to account, Stephen," she said, her tone softening slightly. "That's why this ambush is so disappointing. Your viewers deserve to know when your questions are genuinely about public interest and when they're protecting corporate profit margins." The audience began murmuring louder, some even applauding Crockett's candor. Backstage, network executives were frantically calling the show's control room, demanding immediate intervention. Colbert, visibly struggling, attempted to regain some semblance of control. "Those are serious allegations, Representative, and completely unfounded. Our editorial decisions are independent," Crockett finished for him, reaching into her bag. "Then explain this email I received yesterday from your senior producer, detailing tonight's topics, none of which you've actually asked about, and assuring me of a friendly, policy-focused conversation. Should I read it to your audience?" The control room finally managed to get the floor director's attention, who signaled frantically to cut to commercial. But Colbert, his professional pride wounded, waved him off. This confrontation had become personal, and he wasn't about to let Crockett have the last word. "With all due respect, Congresswoman," he said, his voice regaining some of its trademark confidence, "you're connecting dots that don't exist. My questions tonight reflect concerns shared by many Americans about the consistency of your positions." Crockett laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Which positions exactly? The ones your researchers told my team we'd discuss, or these cherry-picked gotcha moments you've prepared? You haven't asked a single question about my health care reform bill, despite promising my team that would be our focus tonight." The tension in the studio was electric. Camera operators, abandoning protocol, shifted to capture reactions from the increasingly engaged audience. Production assistants whispered urgently into headsets, but no one dared interrupt what was quickly becoming late-night television history. "Let me be clear," Crockett said, turning to address the audience directly. "I came here tonight expecting Stephen Colbert, the man who fearlessly challenged power, not a corporate mouthpiece defending tax loopholes that cost American taxpayers billions every year." The audience erupted in a mixture of gasps, applause, and shouts. Some stood up, creating a surreal atmosphere of participatory theater. Colbert, recognizing the moment was spiraling beyond recovery, finally signaled to cut to commercial. But Crockett wasn't finished. "Your viewers," she said, pointing toward the camera, "should ask themselves why certain topics receive scrutiny on this show, while others, like the media consolidation bill I'm proposing that would affect your parent company, get hit jobs, disguised as interviews." Colbert stood now too, his legendary composure completely abandoned. "That's absolutely false," he said, his voice raised. "My editorial integrity has never been compromised by corporate interests." "Then let's discuss my actual legislation," Crockett challenged. "Let's talk about how 5 companies control over 90% of media in America and how that threatens our democracy. Let's talk about the anonymous political donations these companies make while shaping public opinion. Would you like to have that conversation instead, Stephen?" The control room, finally taking emergency measures, began playing the show's theme. Music, the universal signal that the segment was being forcibly ended. But neither Colbert nor Crockett acknowledged it. "You're manipulating this situation to avoid legitimate questions about your record," Colbert accused, his frustration evident. "And you're hiding behind journalistic pretense while serving corporate interests," Crockett fired back. She reached up to her lapel microphone. "Your viewers deserve better than this, and frankly so do I." With deliberate movements, she unpinned her microphone and placed it on the table between them. The symbolic weight of the gesture was lost on no one. The audience, fully invested in the drama now, began to murmur loudly. "Thank you for demonstrating exactly why my media transparency legislation is so necessary," Crockett said, gathering her papers and standing tall. "America needs to know who's really pulling the strings behind their favorite shows." With that, she turned and walked off the set, leaving Colbert standing alone, microphone in hand, as the cameras continued to roll. For several seconds, an eternity in television time, he stood frozen, the carefully constructed persona of America's beloved late-night host visibly crumbling. The control room finally managed to cut to commercial, but the damage was done. Backstage, chaos erupted. Production assistants scrambled to prepare for the next segment while network executives demanded explanations. Social media was already lighting up with clips of the exchange, hashtags forming spontaneously as viewers debated what they'd just witnessed. Crockett, escorted by her staff through the backstage area, maintained her composure until reaching the privacy of her designated dressing room. Only then did she allow herself a deep, shaking breath, the adrenaline of the confrontation finally catching up with her. "That wasn't how I planned to announce my media reform bill," she said to her communications director, who looked simultaneously horrified and impressed. "No," he agreed, already scanning the explosion of notifications on his phone. "But it might have been more effective than our planned press conference." Meanwhile, on set, the commercial break was ending, and Colbert had to somehow salvage what remained of his show. The band played him back in as he returned to his desk, visibly rattled but attempting to regain his professional demeanor. "Well," he said to the still buzzing audience, "that was something." He attempted a laugh that fell flat. "When we return, we'll be talking with our next guest, hopefully with fewer accusations of corporate conspiracy." The joke landed poorly, eliciting only scattered, uncomfortable laughter. In the control room, producers watched the real-time social media response with growing alarm. The hashtag #CrocketColbert Showdown was trending nationally within minutes, with video clips spreading across platforms at a viral pace. By morning, the confrontation would dominate news cycles. Media analysts would dissect every word, every gesture. Crockett's office would be flooded with interview requests as her proposed. Legislation gained unprecedented public attention. Network executives would hold emergency meetings to discuss damage control. And Stephen Colbert, for the first time in his stellar career, would find himself on the defensive, his carefully cultivated image as truth-teller to power severely compromised. As the show limped to its conclusion that night, viewers witnessed something rare in carefully orchestrated late-night television: authenticity and raw conflict that cut through the usual polished performance. For better or worse, both Colbert and Crockett had revealed aspects of themselves typically hidden behind public personas. 2 days later, when Crockett formally introduced her Media Ownership Transparency Act on the House floor, she made no mention of the late-night confrontation that had catapulted it into public consciousness. She didn't need to. Video clips of her walkout had been viewed over 30 million times across platforms. Late-night television would never be quite the same. The incident forced a national conversation about the intersection of entertainment, journalism, and corporate influence. Discussions that extended far beyond the usual political bubbles into mainstream American consciousness. As for Colbert, he addressed the controversy on his next show with a carefully worded statement about passionate disagreements and respect for all guests before pivoting to safer topics. But viewers noticed a subtle shift in his approach to political interviews in the weeks that followed, a return to the sharper, more independent voice that had first endeared him to audiences. The Colbert-Crockett Showdown, as it came to be known, would be referenced in journalism schools and media studies programs for years to come. A case study in the complexities of modern broadcast journalism and the rare, unscripted moments when the carefully constructed facades of public figures fall away, revealing the messy, authentic humanity beneath. In Washington, Crockett found her political capital unexpectedly enhanced. Colleagues who had previously kept their distance now approached her as someone who couldn't be easily intimidated. The incident had transformed her overnight from a relatively unknown freshman representative to a national figure symbolizing resistance to corporate media influence. As for the viewers who witnessed it live, they were left with an indelible impression of what happens when carefully crafted, public images collide with unexpected authenticity. A rare glimpse behind the curtain of media performance that revealed the complex power dynamics shaping the information they consume daily. In the end, both Colbert and Crockett moved forward, their public personas forever altered by those 11 minutes of unscripted confrontation. But the questions raised lingered in the public consciousness. Who shapes our media narratives? Whose interests do they serve? And what happens when someone refuses to play by the unwritten rules governing public discourse? Sometimes, as viewers of The Late Show discovered that night, the most revealing moments in television are those never meant to be broadcast at all.